On December 13th, 1945, at 9 o'clock in the morning, a 22-year-old woman walked to the gallows in Hameln prison, Germany. Irma Grese had become one of the youngest people ever executed for war crimes. But her age was not what made her case extraordinary. What haunted observers then, and challenges us today, was a more unsettling question. How does someone so young, from such ordinary circumstances, become capable of participating in humanity's darkest chapter? Irma Ida Ilse Grese was born on October 7th, 1923, in the small village of Recken, in what was then the German state of Mecklenburg. Her father, Alfred Grese, worked as a dairy farmer and part-time laborer, struggling to make ends meet in the economic chaos that followed Germany's defeat in World War I. Her mother, Berta, managed the household and helped with farm work while raising 5 children. By all accounts, the Grese family was unremarkable, working-class Germans trying to survive in a nation grappling with humiliation, hyperinflation, and political upheaval. The Germany of Irma's childhood was a country in crisis. The Treaty of Versailles had imposed devastating reparations, and by 1923, the year of her birth, hyperinflation had reached catastrophic levels. A loaf of bread that cost 200 marks in January cost 200 billion marks by November. For families like the Greses, this economic collapse wasn't just numbers on paper, it meant genuine hardship, uncertainty, and a growing sense that the old order had failed them. Rural Mecklenburg, where Irma grew up, was particularly hard hit. Small farmers and agricultural workers watched their savings disappear and their way of life threatened. This economic devastation created fertile ground for political extremism. The Nazi Party, still a fringe movement when Irma was born, would find many of its earliest supporters among exactly these kinds of communities, places where traditional authority had lost credibility and people were desperate for someone to blame. As Irma entered childhood, Adolf Hitler was beginning his rise to power. The failed beer hall putsch in Munich occurred when she was just 2 months old. By the time she started school, Hitler had written Mein Kampf and was rebuilding the Nazi Party. The economic crisis that defined her early years wasn't just background noise, it was the foundation upon which her entire worldview would be constructed. The Grese household itself was marked by tension and conflict. Alfred Grese was reportedly a strict and often violent father who demanded absolute obedience from his children. Irma, according to later accounts from family members, was rebellious from an early age, frequently clashing with her father's authoritarian style. This family dynamic, authoritarian control met with defiant resistance, would prove significant in shaping her personality. When Irma was 9 years old, her mother Berta committed suicide. The exact circumstances remain unclear, but the impact on the family was devastating. Alfred Grese, left to manage 5 children while working the farm, became even more harsh and controlling. For Irma, her mother's death marked the end of whatever stability her childhood had possessed. She would later tell interrogators that this event fundamentally changed her relationship with her family and her understanding of the world. The early 1930s brought the Nazi Party to power, and with it, a complete transformation of German society. When Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, Irma was 9 years old. The changes came quickly to even small villages like Recken. Nazi party rallies, parades, and meetings became regular features of community life. Schools introduced new curricula emphasizing racial theory, German superiority, and absolute loyalty to the state. For young Germans like Irma, Nazism wasn't an alien ideology imposed from above. It was simply the way things were. The Nazi Party worked systematically to capture the minds of children and teenagers through youth organizations. The League of German Girls, the female counterpart to the Hitler Youth, offered adventure, purpose, and escape from difficult family situations. For a girl from a troubled home like Irma, these organizations provided something her family couldn't: a sense of belonging and importance. Irma joined the League of German Girls as soon as she was eligible. By all accounts, she thrived in the organization's structure and ideology. The League emphasized physical fitness, racial purity, and preparation for motherhood in service to the Reich. More importantly for Irma, it offered an alternative source of authority to her father and a community where her rebellious nature could be channeled into socially approved directions. The Nazi indoctrination she received was systematic and comprehensive. In school, she learned that Germans were a master race destined to rule over inferior peoples. She learned that Jews were parasites responsible for Germany's problems, that Slavs were subhuman, and that Germany had the right and duty to expand its territory. These weren't presented as political opinions, but as scientific facts, taught alongside mathematics and geography. As Irma moved through her teenage years, anti-Semitism became normalized in ways that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 legally codified Jewish exclusion from German society. Local Jewish businesses were boycotted, then closed. Jewish children disappeared from schools. In rural areas like Mecklenburg, where Jewish populations were small, this process was often quiet and gradual, making it easier for ordinary Germans to ignore or rationalize. By the time World War II began in September 1939, Irma was 15 years old and had spent nearly half her life under Nazi rule. The war brought new opportunities for advancement within the Nazi system, particularly for young people willing to embrace the ideology completely. For women, this often meant roles in the expanding network of concentration camps, labor camps, and other institutions designed to implement Nazi racial policies. Irma left school at age 15 and took a series of jobs, first in agriculture, then in a shop, and finally in a munitions factory. None of these positions satisfied her ambitions. She had grown up believing she was part of a superior race destined for greatness, but found herself stuck in low-paying, low-status work. The Nazi system had promised her importance and purpose, but civilian life offered only routine drudgery. In 1942, as the war expanded and the Nazi camp system grew rapidly, the SS began actively recruiting young German women to serve as guards and administrators. These positions offered steady pay, advancement opportunities, and the chance to serve the Reich in what was presented as important, patriotic work. For someone like Irma, young, ideologically committed, and seeking escape from limited civilian prospects, such opportunities appeared attractive. The decision to volunteer for camp service was not unusual among young German women of her generation. Thousands made similar choices, drawn by a combination of ideological commitment, economic necessity, and personal ambition. What made Irma's case different was not her decision to volunteer, but what she would do once she entered the camp system. Her family later claimed they tried to discourage her from taking such work, but Irma was determined. At 18 years old, she had spent most of her life under Nazi rule and genuinely believed in the ideology she had been taught. She saw camp work not as something sinister, but as an opportunity to serve her country and advance her career within the system that had shaped her entire worldview. Ravensbrück concentration camp, located 50 miles north of Berlin, was unlike anything Irma Grese had experienced in her rural upbringing. Built in 1939 as the Reich's primary concentration camp for women, Ravensbrück had evolved into a vast complex housing over 15,000 prisoners by the time Irma arrived for training in March 1942. The camp's layout was methodically designed to facilitate control and dehumanization. Rows of wooden barracks surrounded by electrified fences, watchtowers positioned at strategic intervals, and a carefully planned hierarchy that placed German guards at the absolute top of a brutal social order. The SS had developed a systematic approach to training female guards that combined ideological reinforcement with practical instruction in camp operations. Irma and her fellow trainees were taught that the prisoners under their control were enemies of the German people, criminals, political subversives, asocials, and racial undesirables who threatened the very survival of the Reich. This wasn't presented as opinion, but as established fact, requiring no moral reflection or personal judgment. The training process deliberately broke down normal human empathy through gradual exposure to violence and dehumanization. New guards were first assigned to observe experienced personnel, watching how orders were given and punishment administered. They learned that prisoners were to be addressed only by numbers, never names, and that any sign of weakness or sympathy would be seen as betrayal of their duty to the German people. Chief Warden Johanna Langefeld ran the women's section at Ravensbrück with military precision. A former social worker who had joined the Nazi Party in 1931, Langefeld had transformed herself into an efficient administrator of brutality. She demanded absolute obedience from her guards and ruthless efficiency in managing prisoners. Under her supervision, Irma learned that success in the camp system required not just following orders, but demonstrating enthusiasm for the work. The daily routine at Ravensbrück was designed to strip prisoners of their humanity while requiring guards to participate actively in their degradation. Morning roll call, called appel, could last for hours as prisoners stood at attention in all weather conditions while guards counted and recounted, looking for any excuse to impose punishment. Guards were expected to strike prisoners who moved, spoke, or showed any sign of weakness. For new guards like Irma, administering these beatings was not optional. It was a required demonstration of loyalty to the system. Irma adapted to this environment with disturbing ease. Unlike some guards who struggled with the violence or tried to minimize their participation, she embraced her role with apparent enthusiasm. Prisoners who survived Ravensbrück would later testify that Grese stood out among the guards for her willingness to inflict punishment and her apparent enjoyment of prisoner suffering. Within weeks of arriving at the camp, she had earned a reputation for particular cruelty. The camp structure created a complex hierarchy among prisoners that guards learned to exploit. German political prisoners, arrested for opposition to the Nazi regime, occupied the highest position among inmates and often served as block leaders and work supervisors. Below them were other German prisoners, criminals and so-called asocials. At the bottom were foreign prisoners, Jews, Roma, and others deemed racially inferior by Nazi ideology. Guards were taught to manipulate these divisions, using prisoner functionaries to maintain order while avoiding direct responsibility for day-to-day brutality. However, Irma showed little interest in this indirect approach. She preferred direct confrontation and physical violence, establishing herself as someone who needed no intermediary to impose her will on prisoners. The work assignments at Ravensbrück were designed to exhaust and demoralize prisoners while contributing to the German war effort. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts in munitions factories, textile mills, and construction projects. Guards like Irma were responsible for supervising work details, ensuring quotas were met, and punishing any prisoner who failed to maintain the required pace. These supervision duties provided numerous opportunities for abuse, which Irma reportedly seized with enthusiasm. Medical experiments conducted at Ravensbrück added another layer of horror to the camp's operations. Polish prisoners were subjected to deliberate bone and muscle injuries to test experimental treatments. Guards were required to select prisoners for these procedures and ensure their cooperation. Former prisoners later testified that Irma participated in these selections with apparent indifference to the suffering they would cause. The camp's punishment system was elaborate and deliberately excessive. Minor infractions, speaking during roll call, working too slowly, or failing to maintain proper posture, could result in beatings, confinement in punishment cells, or assignment to particularly brutal work details. Guards were encouraged to report infractions and were evaluated based on their vigilance in identifying prisoner misbehavior. Irma excelled in this environment. She developed a reputation for reporting infractions that other guards might have ignored and for administering punishments with excessive force. Prisoners learned to fear her approach and to avoid drawing her attention. Some guards found ways to show small mercies to prisoners when unobserved, but Irma demonstrated no such inclinations. By the end of 1942, Irma had been promoted to the rank of Aufseherin, or overseer, recognizing her effectiveness in maintaining camp discipline. This promotion came with increased responsibilities and greater authority over prisoners. She was assigned to supervise larger work details and given authority to impose punishments without seeking approval from senior guards. The promotion also brought her into closer contact with the camp's administrative operations. She attended briefings where camp policies were explained and future operations planned. These meetings reinforced the ideological framework that justified the camp's existence, while providing practical instruction in implementing increasingly harsh measures against prisoners. During this period, Irma developed relationships with other guards who shared her enthusiasm for the work. These friendships were built around shared participation in violence and mutual reinforcement of Nazi ideology. The guards created their own social world within the camp, complete with parties, romantic relationships, and recreational activities that provided stark contrast to the suffering they administered daily. The camp's isolation from normal German society allowed this culture of violence to develop without external oversight or moral questioning. Guards lived in comfortable quarters within the camp complex, ate well, and enjoyed privileges that were impossible for most Germans during wartime. This physical comfort, combined with constant ideological reinforcement, created conditions where extreme brutality became normalized and even celebrated. As 1943 began, Irma had fully adapted to life as a concentration camp guard. She had demonstrated her value to the SS administration through her willingness to use violence and her effectiveness in controlling prisoners. Her superiors had noted her potential for greater responsibilities within the expanding camp system. The experience at Ravensbrück had completed her transformation from a rebellious farm girl into a committed participant in Nazi genocide. She had learned that cruelty brought rewards, that prisoners were less than human, and that her role in their suffering was not just acceptable, but patriotic duty. This transformation would soon be tested on an even larger stage, as the SS prepared to transfer her to a camp where the systematic murder of human beings was not just a byproduct of harsh conditions, but the primary purpose of the operation. In March 1943, Irma Grese received orders for transfer to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest and most deadly of Nazi concentration camps. For the SS, this transfer represented a promotion, recognition of her effectiveness at Ravensbrück, and confidence in her ability to handle greater responsibilities. For Grese, it meant entry into the epicenter of the Holocaust, where systematic murder had been refined into an industrial process. Auschwitz-Birkenau was unlike any other installation in the Nazi camp system. While Ravensbrück had been brutal, its primary purpose was imprisonment and forced labor. Birkenau was designed specifically for extermination. The camp complex covered 15 square miles and contained 4 large gas chambers disguised as shower facilities, each capable of killing 2,000 people at once. By the time Grese arrived, the camp was murdering thousands of Jews daily from across occupied Europe. The women's section of Birkenau, known as Camp Belied, housed female prisoners in conditions of unprecedented squalor and overcrowding. Wooden barracks designed for 500 people regularly held over 1,000. Sanitation was virtually non-existent, disease was rampant, and death from starvation, exhaustion, and illness was routine. Guards like Grese were responsible for maintaining order in this environment while facilitating the selection process that determined who would live temporarily and who would die immediately. Grese was assigned as deputy head of the women's camp under Chief Warden Elisabeth Volkenrath. This position gave her authority over thousands of prisoners and direct involvement in the selection process that sent women and children to the gas chambers. The selections occurred regularly, when new transports arrived, during periodic camp inspections, and whenever camp officials decided the population needed reduction. The selection process was central to Birkenau's function as an extermination center. SS doctors, most notably Joseph Mengele, would position themselves as prisoners disembarked from cattle cars. With a simple gesture, left or right, they determined immediate death or temporary survival. Grese's role was to ensure prisoners followed directions quickly and quietly, preventing panic that might disrupt the operation's efficiency. Survivors later testified that Grese approached these selections with enthusiasm that disturbed even other guards. While some SS personnel treated selections as unpleasant duty, Grese appeared to enjoy the power of life and death. She would position herself prominently during the process, ensuring prisoners saw her authority and feared her presence. The year 1944 brought the most intensive period of mass murder in Auschwitz's history with the arrival of Hungarian Jews. Following Germany's occupation of Hungary in March 1944, over 400,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz in just 8 weeks. This operation, known as Action Höss after Camp Commandant Rudolf Höss, tested the facility's killing capacity to its absolute limits. During this period, Grese worked 18-hour days supervising the reception and processing of Hungarian transports. Trains arrived multiple times daily, each carrying 2,000 to 3,000 people who had been traveling for days without food, water, or sanitation. The selection process had to move quickly to handle the volume, leaving no time for hesitation or mercy. Prisoner testimony from this period reveals the extent of Grese's personal cruelty beyond her official duties. Survivors remembered her beating women with her hands, a riding crop, and her service pistol. She reportedly took particular pleasure in tormenting mothers who had been separated from their children, often telling them their children were already dead when they asked about their whereabouts. One documented incident involved Grese selecting a pregnant woman for immediate execution after the woman begged to remain with other family members. According to witness testimony, Grese not only sent the woman to the gas chamber, but made sure she understood exactly what was happening to her. Such personal cruelty went far beyond the requirements of her position and demonstrated a level of sadism that shocked even other camp personnel. Grese's relationship with Dr. Mengele became particularly significant during this period. Mengele's medical experiments required a steady supply of subjects, and Grese was responsible for providing prisoners who met his specifications. She would select twins, dwarfs, and individuals with unusual physical characteristics for Mengele's research, knowing that these selections meant torture disguised as medical experimentation. The collaboration between Grese and Mengele illustrates how individual choices amplified the systematic nature of Nazi genocide. While both were operating within an institutional framework designed for mass murder, their personal enthusiasm for cruelty made the system even more deadly and traumatic for victims. Guards at Birkenau lived in stark contrast to the prisoners they supervised. They enjoyed comfortable quarters, adequate food, and regular leave to visit family or vacation destinations. This comfortable existence, maintained through prisoner-slave labor, created a surreal environment where perpetrators could participate in mass murder during the day and enjoy normal social activities in the evening. Grese used her position to accumulate personal wealth by confiscating valuables from prisoners and demanding bribes for small favors. She wore expensive clothing and jewelry taken from victims, displaying these possessions as symbols of her status within the camp hierarchy. This behavior was common among camp personnel, but Grese's ostentation was noted even by her colleagues. The personal relationships Grese developed with other camp personnel further normalized her participation in genocide. She had romantic relationships with several SS officers and maintained friendships with other female guards who shared her enthusiasm for violence. These relationships created a social world where mass murder was treated as routine work deserving of relaxation and celebration. Prisoner testimony consistently described Grese as someone who exceeded even the brutal norms of Auschwitz. Survivors remembered her laughter during selections, her pleasure in delivering bad news to prisoners, and her willingness to use violence for minor infractions or personal amusement. Unlike some guards who showed occasional mercy when unobserved, Grese demonstrated consistent cruelty regardless of circumstances. The nickname Hyena of Auschwitz emerged from prisoner observations of her behavior during this period. Survivors noted that she seemed to feed on prisoner suffering in ways that reminded them of scavenging animals. The comparison to a hyena, an animal that preys on the weak and wounded, captured both her predatory nature and her apparent enjoyment of others' pain. By late 1944, Grese had become one of the most feared figures in the women's section of Birkenau. Her reputation for cruelty preceded her, causing prisoners to change direction when they saw her approaching. This fear gave her additional power within the camp hierarchy and reinforced her sense of importance and authority. The systematic nature of murder at Birkenau required thousands of individual choices by perpetrators like Grese. Each selection, each beating, each act of cruelty represented a personal decision to participate in genocide. While the institutional framework made such choices easier, they remained choices nonetheless. By November 1944, the thunder of Soviet artillery could be heard from Auschwitz-Birkenau as the Red Army advanced through Poland. The systematic murder that had defined the camp's operation for over 2 years was hastily winding down as SS officials began the complex process of destroying evidence and evacuating personnel. For Irma Grese, this marked the beginning of the end of her reign of terror, though she would continue to inflict suffering on prisoners during the chaotic final months of the war. The evacuation of Auschwitz began in earnest in January 1945 as Soviet forces closed to within 20 miles of the camp complex. SS officials faced a logistical nightmare: how to move tens of thousands of prisoners, destroy incriminating evidence, and evacuate personnel before being overrun. The solution was a series of forced marches westward that would become known as death marches, killing thousands of prisoners who had survived years of imprisonment. Grese was assigned to supervise one of these evacuation columns, responsible for ensuring that female prisoners reached their destination regardless of their physical condition. The march westward covered over 100 miles in brutal winter conditions, with prisoners receiving minimal food and no adequate clothing for the sub-zero temperatures. Guards shot anyone who fell behind, couldn't keep pace, or showed signs of collapse. Survivors of these marches later testified that Grese maintained her characteristic cruelty even during this desperate period. She continued to beat prisoners who stumbled, denied them rest periods, and showed no mercy for those suffering from frostbite or exhaustion. Her behavior during the evacuation demonstrated that her sadism was not dependent on the structured environment of the camp, but was a fundamental aspect of her character. The destination for Grese's evacuation column was Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany. Originally established as a prisoner of war camp, Bergen-Belsen had been converted into a concentration camp in 1943 and was intended to serve as a holding facility for prisoners who might be exchanged for German civilians held by the Allies. By 1945, however, it had become a dumping ground for prisoners evacuated from camps in the east. Bergen-Belsen in early 1945 was a scene of unimaginable horror. The camp's infrastructure, designed for a few thousand prisoners, was overwhelmed by the arrival of tens of thousands of evacuees from Auschwitz and other eastern camps. Sanitation systems collapsed completely. Food supplies were virtually non-existent, and disease spread unchecked through the overcrowded barracks. Typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis killed hundreds of prisoners daily. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be disposed of, creating massive piles of corpses throughout the camp. The living were often too weak to move away from the dead, creating conditions that defied human comprehension. Guards like Grese were expected to maintain order in this environment, but the collapse of the Nazi system had made normal camp operations impossible. Despite these conditions, Grese continued to demonstrate the same callousness that had characterized her service at Auschwitz. Prisoners who survived Bergen-Belsen remembered her indifference to their suffering and her continued willingness to use violence against people who were clearly dying. She showed no recognition that the world she had known was ending or that her actions might soon face scrutiny. On April 15, 1945, British forces of the 11th Armored Division reached Bergen-Belsen. What they discovered shocked even battle-hardened soldiers who had been fighting across Europe for years. The camp contained over 60,000 prisoners, many near death from starvation and disease. Approximately 13,000 unburied corpses lay scattered throughout the facility. British Army Captain Derek Sington, among the first officers to enter the camp, later wrote that the scene exceeded anything his imagination could have conceived. Prisoners who could still move approached the liberators like living skeletons, desperate for food and water, but often too weak to speak. The smell of death and human waste was so overwhelming that many soldiers had to step outside to vomit. The British immediately began organizing relief efforts, bringing in medical personnel, food supplies, and equipment to dispose of the dead. However, the sheer scale of the humanitarian crisis meant that thousands of prisoners continued to die even after liberation. The British estimated that over 9,000 people died in the weeks following liberation, their bodies too damaged by prolonged starvation and disease to recover. For the camp's SS personnel, liberation meant the end of their authority and the beginning of their accountability. Many had fled in the days before the British arrival, but Grese and several other guards had remained at their posts, apparently believing they could explain their actions as following orders. This decision would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. British forces immediately detained all SS personnel found at the camp, including Grese. Military intelligence officers began the complex process of identifying war criminals among the captured guards and administrators. The British had been preparing for this moment throughout the war, developing legal frameworks and gathering evidence for prosecuting those responsible for atrocities against civilians. The identification process relied heavily on survivor testimony. Despite their weakened condition, many Bergen-Belsen prisoners were eager to identify guards who had abused them. Grese's distinctive appearance, blonde hair, attractive features, and relatively young age made her easily recognizable to survivors from both Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. Within days of her capture, multiple survivors had identified Grese as one of the most brutal guards they had encountered. Their testimony revealed not just her participation in camp operations, but her apparent enjoyment of prisoner suffering. British investigators quickly recognized that they had captured someone who would be central to any war crimes prosecution. The testimony gathered during these initial interviews was devastating. Survivors described specific incidents of cruelty, provided details about the selection process at Auschwitz, and testified to Grese's role in sending thousands to their deaths. Unlike some guards who claimed ignorance of the camp's true purpose, Grese's actions demonstrated clear knowledge and willing participation in genocide. British military authorities also began the grim task of documenting conditions at Bergen-Belsen for use as evidence in future trials. Photographers and film crews recorded the scenes of devastation, creating a visual record that would shock the world and provide irrefutable evidence of Nazi crimes. These images would become some of the most powerful documentation of Holocaust atrocities. As news of Bergen-Belsen's liberation spread, public opinion in Britain and the United States hardened against Germany and increased pressure for swift justice. The discovery of the camps provided visual evidence of Nazi brutality that made denial impossible and created popular demand for severe punishment of those responsible. On September 17, 1945, 5 months after the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, British military authorities convened the first major war crimes trial of the post-war era. The Bergen-Belsen trial, as it became known, would establish crucial precedents for international justice and test whether legal systems could adequately respond to crimes of unprecedented scale and brutality. For Irma Grese, now 21 years old, it marked the beginning of a legal process that would determine whether she would live or die. The British had chosen to conduct the trial under military rather than civilian law, recognizing that traditional legal frameworks were inadequate for addressing systematic genocide. The court was established under the Royal Warrant of June 14, 1945, which gave British military courts jurisdiction over war crimes committed against British subjects or in areas under British control. This legal innovation would later influence the Nuremberg trials and the development of international criminal law. 45 defendants were charged in connection with crimes at Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz, ranging from commandants and doctors to guards and administrators. Grese was among 11 defendants facing charges that could result in death sentences. The prosecution alleged that she had committed war crimes through her participation in selections, systematic abuse of prisoners, and willing collaboration in mass murder. The trial took place in the gymnasium of a former Wehrmacht barracks in Lüneburg, Germany, transformed into a makeshift courtroom. 5 British military officers served as judges, with Colonel T.M. Backhouse presiding. The proceedings were conducted in German and English, with interpreters ensuring that defendants could understand the charges against them and participate in their defense. Grese's behavior during the trial struck observers as remarkably composed for someone facing execution. She appeared in court wearing civilian clothes provided by British authorities, her blonde hair neatly arranged and her demeanor calm and attentive. This composure contrasted sharply with some co-defendants who showed obvious signs of stress and fear. Court reporters noted that she seemed more concerned with her appearance than with the gravity of the charges against her. The prosecution's case against Grese was built primarily on survivor testimony, supported by documentary evidence and expert witnesses who could explain the systematic nature of Nazi crimes. Over several weeks, dozens of former prisoners took the stand to describe specific instances of cruelty and abuse they had witnessed or experienced at her hands. One of the most damaging witnesses was Hanka Rosenweig, a Polish Jew who had survived both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. She testified that Grese had personally selected her sister for the gas chambers at Auschwitz and had beaten her with a riding crop for attempting to say goodbye. Rosenweig's testimony was particularly powerful because she could provide specific details about dates, locations, and circumstances that corroborated other witnesses' accounts. Dr. Ada Bimko, a Polish physician who had worked in the camp hospital at Bergen-Belsen, testified about Grese's role in medical selections. She described how Grese would tour the hospital barracks, selecting weakened patients for execution with apparent indifference to their medical conditions or prospects for recovery. Bimko's medical training allowed her to provide expert assessment of the deliberate nature of these selections. The testimony revealed patterns of behavior that went far beyond following orders. Witnesses described Grese's evident pleasure in causing pain, her laughter during selections, and her willingness to inflict punishment for minor infractions or personal amusement. This evidence was crucial for establishing individual criminal responsibility rather than mere participation in a criminal system. Grese's defense strategy relied heavily on the argument that she had been following orders and had no choice but to comply with SS directives. Her attorney, Major L.A. Cranfield, argued that she was a young woman caught up in a system beyond her understanding or control. He portrayed her as a victim of Nazi indoctrination, who had been manipulated into participating in crimes she didn't fully comprehend. The defense also attempted to minimize the severity of her actions by arguing that conditions at the camps were the result of wartime pressures rather than deliberate policy. Cranfield suggested that overcrowding, disease, and high death rates were unfortunate consequences of Germany's deteriorating situation rather than intentional genocide. However, this defense strategy faced substantial challenges when confronted with the prosecution's evidence. Witness after witness testified to Grese's apparent enthusiasm for violence and her voluntary participation in activities that exceeded her required duties. The prosecution demonstrated that she had volunteered for camp service, requested transfers to more active roles, and consistently chosen the most brutal options available to her. Prosecutor Colonel T.L.C. Backhouse systematically dismantled the defense's arguments by presenting evidence of Grese's individual choices and personal responsibility. He argued that following orders could not excuse crimes against humanity, and that Grese's behavior demonstrated personal culpability beyond mere obedience to authority. The prosecution also introduced evidence of Grese's comfortable living conditions and personal enrichment through confiscated prisoner property. This evidence countered defense arguments that she was merely a victim of circumstances by showing her active participation in and benefit from the criminal system. During her own testimony, Grese attempted to minimize her role while acknowledging the basic facts of her service. She claimed that she had been kind to prisoners when possible and had only used violence when absolutely necessary to maintain order. However, her testimony was repeatedly contradicted by survivor witnesses who provided specific examples of unprovoked cruelty and unnecessary violence. The court was particularly struck by Grese's apparent lack of remorse or recognition of the suffering she had caused. Unlike some defendants who expressed regret or claimed ignorance, Grese maintained a defensive posture that suggested she still believed her actions had been justified. Expert testimony from military and medical professionals helped the court understand the systematic nature of Nazi crimes and the specific roles that individuals like Grese had played in implementing genocide. This context was crucial for establishing that the defendants had participated in a coordinated campaign of extermination rather than isolated acts of violence. The trial lasted 54 days, with the court hearing from over 100 witnesses and examining thousands of documents. The extensive evidence gathering reflected British determination to ensure that the proceedings met the highest standards of legal procedure and could not be dismissed as victor's justice. On November 17, 1945, the court delivered its verdicts. Grese was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to death by hanging. The judges concluded that the evidence demonstrated her willing participation in systematic murder and that her individual actions had directly contributed to the deaths of thousands of innocent people. Of the 45 defendants, 11 received death sentences, including Grese and Bergen-Belsen Commandant Josef Kramer. The verdicts sent a clear message that individuals could be held criminally responsible for their participation in genocide, regardless of their position in the hierarchy or claims of following orders. The legal precedents established by the Bergen-Belsen trial would influence international law for decades to come, providing frameworks for prosecuting crimes against humanity and establishing individual accountability for systematic atrocities. For Grese, the verdict meant that her 3 years of wielding absolute power over human life and death would end with the ultimate penalty under law. Following her death sentence on November 17, 1945, Irma Grese was transferred to Hameln prison to await execution. The fortress-like facility, built in the 19th century, had been requisitioned by British authorities to house condemned war criminals. For Grese, the 3 weeks between sentencing and execution would be her final opportunity to confront the magnitude of her crimes and their consequences. Prison records from this period reveal a woman who maintained the same emotional detachment that had characterized her behavior throughout the trial. Unlike some condemned prisoners who experienced breakdowns or religious conversions, Grese showed little evidence of genuine remorse or psychological distress. Prison chaplain Henry Garrica, who ministered to war criminals at various facilities, noted that she remained focused on procedural matters and potential appeals rather than moral reflection on her actions. Greece's legal team filed an appeal with British military authorities, arguing that the evidence against her had been insufficient to justify a death sentence. They contended that witness testimony from concentration camp survivors might be unreliable due to trauma and the passage of time. The appeal also challenged the legal framework of the trial itself, arguing that British military courts lacked proper jurisdiction over crimes committed by German nationals against other foreign nationals. The appeal process revealed the careful legal groundwork that British authorities had established for these prosecutions. Military legal experts had anticipated challenges to jurisdiction and evidence, creating detailed procedures to ensure that convictions could withstand scrutiny. The appeals court reviewed not only the specific evidence against Grese, but also the broader legal precedents being established for international war crimes prosecution. On December 7, 1945, British military authorities rejected Grese's appeal, confirming both her conviction and death sentence. The appeals court concluded that the evidence against her had been overwhelming and that the legal procedures had met appropriate standards for military justice. More significantly, the court affirmed that individuals could be held criminally responsible for crimes against humanity, regardless of their nationality or the location where crimes were committed. During her final week, Grese received visits from family members who had traveled from Mecklenburg to see her. These meetings, monitored by British guards, provided glimpses into her psychological state as execution approached. According to prison records, she expressed concern about how her death would affect her family's reputation, but showed little discussion of her victims or the suffering she had caused. Albert Pierrepoint, Britain's chief executioner, arrived at Hameln Prison on December 12th to prepare for the following morning's executions. Pierrepoint was known for his efficiency and professionalism, having performed over 400 executions during his career. He later wrote that the executions of war criminals presented unique challenges due to the international attention and the historical significance of the proceedings. The execution was scheduled for 9 o'clock on the morning of December 13th, 1945. British authorities had established detailed protocols for these proceedings, ensuring that they met both legal requirements and international standards for humane execution. Representatives from Allied governments, legal observers, and press correspondents were permitted to witness the executions to ensure transparency and proper procedure. Grese's final night was spent in a condemned cell under constant observation by British guards. Prison records indicate that she ate a normal meal and slept for several hours, showing none of the distress that might be expected from someone facing imminent execution. Her composure continued, even as guards prepared her for the final walk to the execution chamber. On the morning of December 13th, Grese walked to the gallows without assistance or apparent distress. Witnesses noted her steady gait and composed demeanor, which stood in stark contrast to some of her co-defendants who required physical support. Pierrepoint later recalled that she showed no signs of fear or emotional breakdown, maintaining the same detachment that had characterized her throughout imprisonment and trial. The execution itself was carried out according to British military protocols, with Pierrepoint ensuring that death was instantaneous and humane. At 22 years old, Grese became one of the youngest people ever executed for war crimes, a distinction that highlighted both the severity of her crimes and the unprecedented nature of the legal proceedings that had condemned her. International reaction to the executions was largely supportive, with allied governments and press organizations endorsing the verdicts as appropriate justice for unprecedented crimes. However, some observers raised questions about executing such young defendants, particularly women, arguing that life imprisonment might be more appropriate given their ages and the systematic indoctrination they had received. The legal precedents established through Greece's trial and execution would prove far more significant than the punishment of any individual perpetrator. The Bergen-Belsen proceedings demonstrated that individuals could be held accountable for systematic atrocities, establishing principles that would guide international law for decades. The concept of crimes against humanity, individual responsibility for genocide, and the rejection of superior orders as absolute defense all emerged from these early post-war trials. The case also highlighted the particular role of women in the Nazi system, challenging assumptions about female participation in violence and genocide. Greece's enthusiastic participation in mass murder forced recognition that women could be active perpetrators rather than passive victims or bystanders. This understanding would influence how historians and legal scholars approached questions of complicity and responsibility in subsequent genocides. For Holocaust education and remembrance, Greece's case provides a troubling but essential example of how ordinary individuals became willing participants in systematic murder. Her background as a farm girl from rural Germany with no apparent predisposition toward violence demonstrates that genocide requires the active participation of people from all walks of life, rather than a small group of ideologically motivated leaders. The testimony gathered during her trial became crucial historical documentation of conditions at Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Survivor witnesses who testified against her provided detailed accounts of camp operations, selection procedures, and daily life under Nazi rule. These testimonies remain among the most important primary sources for understanding the Holocaust and continue to be used in historical research and education. Contemporary relevance of Greece's case extends beyond its historical significance to ongoing questions about individual responsibility in systematic atrocities. Her story illustrates how normal people can become perpetrators when institutional frameworks legitimize violence, and how personal choices remain morally significant even within coercive systems. The case also demonstrates the importance of legal accountability for mass atrocities. The principles established through her prosecution contributed to the development of international criminal law, including the Geneva Conventions, the International Criminal Court, and various tribunals for prosecuting crimes against humanity and genocide. Perhaps most importantly, Greece's execution marked a recognition that civilized societies must respond to the breakdown of civilization itself with justice rather than revenge. The careful legal procedures, the opportunity for defense, and the international oversight of her trial established standards that continue to guide efforts to prosecute mass atrocities while maintaining respect for human rights and legal procedure. The story of Irma Grese ultimately serves as both historical documentation and contemporary warning, a reminder that the capacity for both evil and justice exists within human societies, and that the choices made by individuals, institutions, and nations determine which will prevail. Her path from ordinary origins to notorious criminality and finally to legal accountability demonstrates that while systems can facilitate genocide, individuals remain responsible for their participation, and societies remain capable of delivering justice even for the most heinous crimes.